Good afternoon. My name is John Sebastian. I'm the Vice President for Mission and Ministry at Loyola Marymount University here in Los Angeles, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this mission spotlight on President Biden and Catholicism in the United States, which is sponsored by the Office of Mission and Ministry here at LMU. On 3 separate occasions this semester, I have found myself seated at my desk, ostensibly for the purpose of working, but otherwise unable to unglue myself from media coverage of the day's events. The first such occasion was January 6th, the Wednesday before the start of our spring semester here at LMU. As many of us were toiling feverishly to finish our syllabi and preparing to greet our new students, and as the Capitol erupted into chaos and violence fueled by white supremacy. The second occasion was just 2 short weeks later, the venue the same, the Capitol. This time the site of the inauguration of Joseph Robinette Biden as the 46th President of the United States, a ceremony that featured a 22-year-old Angelina, a sometime resident of the very Westchester neighborhood in which LMU is located, and the first ever Youth Poet Laureate of the United States, a young woman named Amanda Gorman, who stood at the lectern in front of the Capitol building channeling the spirit of Maya Angelou, her predecessor as inaugural poet, as she intoned the opening lines of her remarkable poem, The Hill We Climb. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade, we've braved the belly of the beast, we've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. The third occasion was today, as we held our breath awaiting the verdict in the case of Derek Chauvin, a man accused of stopping another human being, a brother to all of us, from drawing his own breath. Many of us, all of us, I hope, experienced relief today. And yet we must remember that justice for one is not justice for all, and that legal justice after the fact is no substitute for the freedom that belongs to each one of us as children of a loving God and residents of this country. What happened to George Floyd and to Breonna Taylor and to Ahmaud Arbery and to Dante Wright and to Adam Toledo should not have happened to any of them and should never happen again. So before we begin today's proceedings, I would like to invite all of us to take a moment of silence in memory of George Floyd and the countless victims of racial violence, and to pray for justice for all those who suffer under and are diminished by the evils of racism and white supremacy. Thank you. So today, as we look back on January 6th and January 20th in the light of April 20th, we are fortunate to have with us as our guest, Dr. Massimo Faggioli, Professor of Historical Theology in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University in Philadelphia. He is the author of the book, Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States, the publication of which coincided with the inauguration in January of Joe Biden as only the 2nd Catholic president in the history of the United States. Dr. Faggioli worked in the John XXIII Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna between 1996 and 2008, and was co-chair of the study group Vatican II Studies for the American Academy of Religion between 2012 and 2017. He has a column in the international version of La Croix, and is contributing writer for Commonweal magazine and for the Italian magazine Il Regno. He is co-editor with Brian Freire of the new series Studies in Global Catholicism for Brill Publishers, the first volume of which is scheduled for release in 2021. His books and articles have been published in more than 10 languages. In addition to his new book on the Biden presidency, his recent work includes The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, Moving Toward Global Catholicity, published by Orbis Books in 2020. He is currently co-editing with Catherine Clifford the Oxford Handbook of Vatican II from Oxford University Press, due out in 2021. And he's under contract with Oxford University Press for a book on the history of the Roman Curia. He was also the recipient of the 2018 Catholic Press Association Award for his book, Catholicism and Citizenship, Political Cultures of the Church in the 21st Century, published by Liturgical Press in 2017. Today, 3 months to the day from the inauguration of President Biden, Dr. Faggioli will share with us some of his reflections on the Biden presidency and how it serves as a starting point for a broader conversation about religion and politics in the United States today, about how faith and civic engagement should and do intersect, about how Pope Francis and President Biden in their respective roles stand at the intersection of strong conservative and progressive currents determined to reshape church and state, about how the media has contributed to the polarization and toxicity of public discourse around beliefs, both religious and political. Following his initial remarks, Dr. Faggioli will be joined for further conversation by Carol Costello, an award-winning journalist and former anchor and correspondent at CNN and HLN. Her distinguished career as a local, regional, and national broadcaster spans 3 decades, covering a broad range of world leaders, events, and politics. Carol joined CNN in 2001 as an anchor on Headline News. From 2012 to 2017, she hosted Newsroom and previously contributed to The Situation Room and anchored Daybreak, the network's former early morning news program. At CNN, Carol was at the forefront of some of the world's most significant stories. She was part of CNN's Peabody Award-winning coverage of the Gulf oil spill, Hurricane Katrina, and the 2008 presidential election. She also reported on Pope Francis's visit to the United States, the Boston Marathon bombing, the last space shuttle launch, the Ohio midterm elections, the shooting at Virginia Tech, the tsunami disaster in South Asia, the Russian school hostage crisis, and Hurricanes Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean. Carol interviewed 4 former US presidents, President Jimmy Carter, President Ronald Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and President Bill Clinton, and she covered 5 presidential inaugurations. Before joining CNN, Carol worked at WJLA TV in Washington, D.C., where she was an anchor and investigative reporter for 5 years. Prior to that, she spent 3 years at WBAL TV in Baltimore. She began her career as a weekend anchor and reporter for WAKR TV in Akron, Ohio, and then moved to WBNS TV in Columbus, Ohio, to serve as the station's principal weeknight anchor. Costello earned a degree in journalism from Kent State University in Ohio. Carol's reporting has been honored numerous times, including with a 1991 Emmy Award for a special on crack and cocaine, a UPI Award, and several Associated Press Awards. She received an Emmy nomination in 1993, then again in 2008 for outstanding coverage of a breaking news story after Benazir Bhutto's assassination. In 2009, she received an individual Emmy nomination for Outstanding Morning Program. Carol currently serves as LMU's First Lady, where she also teaches broadcast journalism. At the conclusion of their conversation, we will open up the program to questions from the audience. If you have a question for either or both of our guests today, please post it using Zoom's Q&A function. Feel free to post your questions during the presentation. You don't have to wait until the start of Q&A. We'll do our best to address as many of those questions as possible in the time allotted. Lastly, I want to thank several people without whom today's program would not be possible, including Eva Cruz-Ado, Senior Administrative Coordinator for the Office of Mission and Ministry, Christine Kale, Associate Director of Communications and Marketing and Communications, Rory Walsh, Technology Support Specialist in Information Technology Services, and above all, Kat Brown, Director of Mission and Identity Programs in Mission and Ministry. Thank you very much to all of you. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. And without further ado, I present to you Dr. Massimo Faggioli.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here in some sense, even if not physically. I remember with fondness my visit in person a few years ago, and I really hope I'll be back in person very soon. And I'm very honored by this invitation because it comes at an auspicious time, because we are getting close to the 100th day of this presidency. And so it's a it's a symbolic moment to reflect on what happened in this last year and in these last few months with our second Catholic president. And so I'm grateful for this invitation, because it's a gift that was unexpected, just like this book was unexpected in some sense, because the idea of writing this book came very late, around October, in these last few weeks of the campaign. And I realized that I had been thinking about this for a long time. In some sense, because I started teaching a course on American Catholicism and American politics since 2010. And so it was 10 years that I was thinking about the meaning of the presence of Catholics in American politics, and especially presidential politics. But in some sense, it's something that started when I came to the United States in 2008 from Italy. And one of the first things was how important the role of religion in politics is, especially presidential politics. And so this book has been written in a few weeks, in part, I mean, drawing from my experience teaching this course in these last 10 years, but also observing very carefully a very specific kind of language and of message which we saw about religion and about Catholicism in the campaign of 2020. And as an historian, because this is my formation, I was trained as an historian, first of all, I realized that there were a few specificities of this campaign that got elected Joe Biden, our second Catholic president. And this is why the book begins with a chapter on the comparison between Joe Biden and the previous Catholic candidates to the US presidency. And it begins with Al Smith, the governor of New York State, who was a candidate for the Democratic Party in 1928. He was a successful governor, very successful, very popular in New York. But this campaign was a disaster. He was crushed. It was his election was a rout, basically. Also because of anti-Catholicism. I saw some documents in the Vatican Secret Archives that were exchanged between prominent U.S. Catholics and the Vatican and the U.S. And the Vatican representative in Washington, D.C., and they observed with horror the vitriol of this campaign against Al Smith as a Catholic. And so it has become famous, this campaign accusing Al Smith of being a plant of the Vatican, of being on the payroll of the Holy See, and with the worst racist stereotypes on Irish Catholics. And so this is the first moment that I think it was worth focusing on, because the natural instinct of Al Smith in 1928 was to deny that his Catholicism was relevant for him at any point, but that didn't work. So that didn't save him from being identified with Catholicism as religion of the immigrant, of the poor immigrants that are like sheep in the eyes of the Vatican. They cannot be relied, they cannot be trusted with the office of the presidency. That was less than 1 century ago. And the second moment in this comparison is the election of John F. Kennedy, of course, in 1960. One of the things that we have forgotten is that in the Democratic Party in 1960, many were skeptical about JFK's run because they remembered how bad it had been for Al Smith in 1928. So there's a whole debate already in 56, when Kennedy is thinking already in 56 about running, can a Catholic candidate win? Are we going to see another kind of disaster like in 1928? But in 1960, it works because it's the age, as Gary Wells famously said, of the two Johns. I mean, John F. Kennedy and Pope John in, in, in the Vatican, who had just called the Second Vatican Council. Catholics had been legitimated by the Second World War. The country had changed enormously since 1928. And so that is one of the key moments in American Catholics becoming mainstream in the United States. But there's also a necessity for John Kennedy in the campaign in 1960 to take a distance from Catholicism. There's this famous speech he gave to an assembly of Baptist ministers in Houston, Texas, in September 1960, where he gives this masterful speech where he says, I'm a candidate who happens to be Catholic. I'm not the Catholic candidate. My Catholicism is private, basically. This is his operation. He tries really to diffuse that threat that was being a Catholic running for presidency, knowing what had happened to his predecessor, Al Smith, in 1928. It's an operation that succeeds, even if many bishops don't like this idea of a Catholic in the White House who's downplaying his Catholicism. But back then, it's a church that has a very strong sense of unity. So the election of John Kennedy is a huge moment of pride for all Catholics. And it's a turning point, no question, in the self-consciousness of Catholics, politically, socially, culturally in this country, but also globally, because as an Italian, I can attest that John Kennedy was and still is enormously popular also among Italian Catholics and European Catholics. It's a mythology of John Kennedy's presidency. And then the third moment, the third candidate, Catholic candidate, John Kerry in 2004. It's a very different America. It's the post 9/11 America. It's an America where candidates are asked what they think about abortion, about same-sex marriage, the hot button issues. And so he's running against a very popular president, George W. Bush, an evangelical, born again, who makes no mystery about his faith, his commitment to Jesus Christ. And John Kerry, for the Democrats, a Catholic who tries to use the same card of John Kennedy 44 years before, when he tries to keep his Catholicism private or not to highlight it and to make a case for a gentle secularity in some sense. It's a strategy that doesn't win, and maybe no strategy could win for him in 2004. But it's interesting because you have a very strong difference between the sitting president who is reelected, also because of his strong evangelical born-again statements and identity, and a Catholic Democrat who in the end acknowledges that his choice to keep his Catholicism private or marginal has been defeated. In 2020, finally, we have Joe Biden, and it's a very interesting interesting solution that Joe Biden finds. And in the end, I believe it's one of the ingredients of his victory, because he's the first Catholic candidate that makes an open claim that he is proud of his Catholicism, that he draws from Catholicism, from his tradition, to deal with the tragedies that he had to go through in his personal life as a human being, but also as a politician. So there are very interesting moments in the campaign of 2020 when Joe Biden quotes from John Paul II and Pope Francis, even Pope Francis' latest encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which was published exactly 1 month before the election of November 3rd. It's the first time when Joe Biden, as a Catholic candidate, he decides not to hide, not to privatize, and not to make relevant his faith for his political persona. That is new, and that's interesting because it's a moment in which the threats against the unity of the United States, the challenges against its political system, the legal order, and the rule of law, they are a symptom that is parallel to the threats against the unity of the Catholic Church. It's a completely different picture from what we saw in 1928 or in 1960 or even 2004. So here Joe Biden is interesting historically also because he's a Catholic who is elected despite a few of these positions on very delicate policies are clearly at odds with official Catholic teaching. And in 2004, that had been a huge problem for John Kerry, especially on abortion, but also same-sex marriage. In 2020, the country has changed and this church has changed. And so Joe Biden is able to keep his faith visible at the same time when he faces a divided church, which is divided also about him. So at the time of Al Smith in 28 or of John Kennedy in 1960, the problem was for America to accept this candidate's Catholicism. In 2020, it's the opposite problem. I mean, America as a country no longer has a problem with a candidate who's Catholic, but are some Catholics that have a problem with that particular candidate who's a member of their own church. That is a very different problem. It's a new situation. And we're still dealing with this because this presidency started less than 3 months ago. And so this is the historical part of this book, which is an attempt more than a biography of the president or of his spirituality. It's an investigation into US Catholicism, which is a very particular kind of Catholic Church. I realized that immediately when I arrived in this country 13 years ago from Italy with a European formation in Germany and in France. And I realized how militant this church is, how big it is, how socially engaged, how defining our religious ideas for the identity of its citizens and of its population. And so this book, in the other chapters, tried to understand what is important in this historical moment to understand this presidency in the context of this Catholic moment. And the most visible factor that must be taken into account to understand this picture is the unique relationship that there is right now between the US president and the Pope in the Vatican, which is very different from all predecessors, because for as a matter of biography. So when John Kennedy is elected in 1960, John Kennedy is in his 40s, and Pope John is in his early 80s. So they belong to two very different generations and two different worlds, really. Now there's a similarity between Joe Biden and Pope Francis. They are more or less of the same generation, and they have gone through an education that has made of them, I believe, less moderate or less centrist than they used to be. Both Joe Biden and Pope Francis, they have discovered a certain courage in going beyond those that they thought were limits of where they could go for Biden on social economic issues and for Pope Francis on theological issues. So, but there's something else that they have in common, Joe Biden and Pope Francis, which is a deep division in their country and in the church. And so Joe Biden is elected by a slight majority of Catholics in this country. In November 2020, almost 50% of Catholics are inclined to see in Donald Trump a legitimate leader, a moral leader. And Pope Francis faces a similar situation. So here Pope Francis has faced huge opposition against some of his statements, of his decisions, of his messages since the very beginning of the pontificate in the spring of 2013. And what's interesting to note is that the headquarters of the opposition against Pope Francis is in the United States. It's in this country, and largely overlaps and coincides with a conservative Catholic culture that saw in Donald Trump the savior from secularism, from socialism, from globalization, and all of that. And so there are a few factors that make that relationship between Joe Biden and Pope Francis unique. Historically, Catholic politicians in this country, especially when they had to run for highest office, they had to make clear that they were not in an alliance with the Pope in Rome. That has not been true in this last year in this campaign, because it was clear that there was an unspoken alliance or convergence, let's say, between Joe Biden and Pope Francis on issues like the environment, or immigrants, or on refugees, more generally on multilateralism. And so this is a very important factor to understand this moment. At the same time, the election of Joe Biden doesn't solve, in my opinion, the problem of this church in this country, because it is a very divided church and it will remain divided. So here, I believe that the election of Joe Biden is important because it interrupts a certain taking for granted conservative narrative that the future of the Catholic Church and of the United States is going to be unquestionably conservative, that there is an undeniable, inevitable conservative future. And so in some sense, there's a parallel between the election of Francis 8 years ago and of Joe Biden in 2020, because they disprove a certain horizon that focuses on the shortcomings of liberalism, of liberal culture. It may be true that liberalism is in crisis, but the Catholic Church managed to elect a pope that was different from those who predicted another John Paul II or another Pope Benedict. And in a similar fashion, the election of Joe Biden has been a surprise because as a Catholic, Joe Biden does not represent the face of 21st century Catholicism. He comes from a 20th century Catholicism, the one of the Catholic ghetto, of the Catholic schools that were much more present, visible than today, from a Catholic Church that was still really a fruit of immigration from Europe. And so Joe Biden is a Catholic who has to make a synthesis between the old Catholic Church in this country of the 20th century and this Catholic Church of the 21st century that is redefined by immigration, that will be no longer white European, and that's very important. And so here Joe Biden and Pope Francis, again, they are in a parallel situation because both Biden and Francis, they have been elected way beyond their prime at the end of their career, but at the same time, they are the ones who I believe are bringing about and making possible the arrival of a new face of Catholicism for Pope Francis at the global level and for Joe Biden nationally. So he's the US president of this country, is not in charge of the US Catholic Church, but of course, is the most important Catholic leader of this country right now. And so there's a very powerful message there that I believe we need to understand and digest in time because, and I conclude here, Joe Biden is only the second Catholic president in US history. If something happens only twice in more than 2 centuries, it means that something's happening. And so we should pay attention because there are so many meanings and symbols and messages in this moment that I think it's worth looking at to understand this church, but also this country more generally. And I hope that my book is a help, is the contribution to understand that. I thank you for your patience, and I'll stop here.
Oh, no, we want you to continue. It's such a fascinating topic and such a fascinating book. So we want to take a deeper dive on some of the things in your book. I read it with great fascination. And, you know, you said the American presidency is an office that is political, but also moral and religious. And President Biden begins his term at a delicate time for both the nation and for the Catholic Church. I agree with you. But as I read that, I couldn't help but think that America is a secular nation and that the presidency should be moral, but not religious, yet it is. What do you make of that?
So I am European. I hold strongly the values of the Enlightenment and so on. So I strongly believe that there has to be a healthy secularity, a space of distance between the church and the state, religion and politics. If you compare the US with European countries, it's very hard for a European to see the United States as a secular country. Because, in part because of what, I mean, Robert Bella decades ago defined as the civil religion that, I mean, keeps this country together, but also because there are positive, visible elements of the religion in this country that are unthinkable in other democracies in Europe, but also, for example, I mean, India constitutionally has been created as a secular democracy. And so the United States has always been multi-religious, multicultural, but secularity has always been, I mean, fluctuating at different levels. And so the 1940s, 50s, the identity of the presidents or of judges was not so considered important. Mm-hmm. After the 70s, 80s, Carter, Ronald Reagan, and so on, it's inevitable that this has become more religious, also because we have found out that, I mean, the secularization doesn't mean the end of religion. It means that religion survives outside of the church, okay, but survives. And so I strongly believe that there should be a secular responsibility of the politicians, of the judges. But I think that this is reality of this country that cannot bear too much secularity.
Well, it's just interesting at this moment in time that so many Catholics are in powerful positions, right? Joe Biden is president, Nancy Pelosi is the House Speaker, John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I'll throw in Steve Bannon, who represents Catholics on the far right, and AOC, who represents Catholics on the far left. All say their Catholicism plays a part in their politics, and they're not afraid to say so. These are very powerful players, as I said. These are positions of influence. So it's tempting to think that Catholicism is sort of taking over American politics. Should we look at it that way?
In some sense, yes. So if one looks at some key institutions, and for example, the Supreme Court, forever it had been dominated by Protestants. Now there are 5 Catholics, 1 former Catholic, and the rest Jews and no Protestant. So that's a huge change. Okay, so this is not because Protestantism has disappeared, but it has become more fragmented. And so there's no longer the so-called Protestant establishment, which was exactly what John Kennedy had to deal with in 1960 when he faced an anti-Catholic campaign in public, but a more dangerous anti-Catholic campaign in secret. And so that was that world. And so right now you have that Catholicism, it has become the single largest church in this country, also because it's the only big church that has not divided itself in 2 or 3 or 4. It's something that happens to all churches after the Civil War and after the civil rights and after the same-sex marriage and so on. And so Catholicism is still one. And so that's why Catholics are overrepresented in some institutions. We don't know if it will stay that way or if there will be a formal separation of some kind. And so there's already, so in the book, I call that a soft schism. So there are already very different kinds of Catholic culture, but it's still one church with one pope, one body of bishops, one set of sacraments.
Yeah.
It's not,
I want to
situation. Yeah.
I want to get into the schism a little later, because I want to right now go to your core question, like, what does it mean to be both Catholic and American? I covered Pope Francis's visit to the United States in 2015. And as I stood, I mean, I followed him, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, DC. Tons of people turned out. It was a celebration. Everything beautiful about Catholicism was on display. And I felt, as a Catholic personally, this is what it means to be Catholic and American. And right now, Pope Francis is a controversial figure. He's not beloved as he was in 2015. And that's confusing. So what, in your mind, does it mean to be Catholic and American?
So it's a complicated question also because we are asking this question now when many people say that our global world will become post-American soon. So for a long time, it helped at answering that question with the idea that we are one thing, I mean, American and Catholic, because Christianity is naturally a Western religion, which is not something that is any longer believed. Okay, because Pope Francis is turning Catholicism global, so he's making Western identity as a foundation for Christianity much more relative, and so that's one first point. Second, in the 20th century, Catholicism and Americanism, they reconcile around issues that are like anti-communism and the fight for human rights and for democracy and so on. That is no longer true or no longer easy, right? Because now you can be a Catholic in Poland, in Hungary, and be very much against human rights for Muslims or Jews and so on. And so it has become more complicated, and articulating these two identities, being American, being Catholic, now has come to the fore because no longer NATO can offer you a mantle to say, well, I'm a Catholic because I'm anti-communist. Well, it's a more complicated world. And so here, in my experience, as a European Catholic, Catholicism in this country has been a masterful experiment in keeping a very Roman identity, but at the same time adapting marvelously to American culture. But now it's very hard to say what is American culture, because there's not one anymore, right? Because once it was the Irish or the Italian Americans and so on. Right now, what is the meaning of being American? It's much more complicated, and that means huge complications for Catholicism.
So complicated. I like how you described Joe Biden's Catholicism. You said he embodies a certain kind of working class Catholicism, the kind that I grew up with in middle America. You know, I'm of Italian descent. So I understand Joe Biden's Catholicism. It wasn't intellectual. It wasn't polarizing because, you know, the times were different when I grew up. So in your mind, is Joe Biden just a quaint throwback from times gone by? Or is he somehow a sign of what Catholicism will become again?
That's a very good question. I believe that he's seeing and describing himself as a member of the people, of the working class that is really traditional Catholicism. It's not something that is fledgling moment, because this is Pope Francis Catholicism. It is based, if there's something Catholic, deeply Catholic, is anti-elitism. And so that explains a lot the huge differences between Joe Biden and John Kennedy, who was a member of the elites. Harvard, his father was a US ambassador to London and all of that. And so this is not Joe Biden. But similarly, East Catholicism is very much the kind of social roots of Pope Francis. I believe that is a symbol of this moment, when you have that if there's something common to many people around the world is anger and rage against the political elites, the business elites, and so on. So here Catholicism as a, I believe, a wise way of articulating that rage and that anger that's justified in many cases. And so here Joe Biden embodies something that I believe it's more than a throwback. It speaks to this moment.
But as you said, in this moment, America is a highly partisan nation. And within Catholicism, the Catholic faith is highly partisan. And I'll just give you an example of how intertwined with politics Catholicism has become. This is a fascinating statistic. Now, keep in mind, as you said, Biden wears his religion openly. He quotes the Bible, he goes to church, he carries a rosary. Yet, according to Pew, among Republican-leaning Catholics, 56% say Biden is not religious. American bishops are in part fueling this. They formed a task force on how to deal with the Biden presidency, and some are openly hostile to Pope Francis. How should we interpret this?
We should interpret this not just as a deep polarization, but also as a symptom of the fact that our political views have become religious. And so once, religion was supposed to shape our political views, now it is vice versa. And so now our views on some issues are become really technically dogmatic, theological. So we think that God speaks to us when we embrace that platform of that party or the other. That's kind of new. It has to do with the new media ecosystem and so on. So here, I believe Joe Biden embodies a possible de-escalation of this, because Joe Biden can be accused of many things probably, but not of being ideological, not of being extremist, not of being subject to ideological views of things. I think he has learned from his mistakes on some policies, and so here it's interesting to see that religion has not disappeared, but it has morphed into political identities. And so here, what both the church, Pope Francis, and the presidency can do is to take back politics into politics and theology, religion into religion.
I say
That's
good luck to that.
complicated. That's complicated.
No, it's complicated, and here's a reason why. So, I talked about the American bishops, wary of progressive Catholics, and Pope Francis's move away from the cultural issues, because that's what Pope Francis wanted us all to do, right? Move away from the cultural issues. Yet the bishops formed this task force. Some prominent Catholic voices, including a retired archbishop, embraced the former President Trump's Stop the Steal movement and even spoke publicly surrounding the events of January 6th. There was a retired archbishop who spoke at that rally, or before it, right? So are these dispositions, are these isolated extremists within the Catholic faith, or do you consider them extremists? Are these just a blip on the radar screen, or will this fight continue?
I think this fight will continue. I think they are extremists. They are not the majority. They are a small minority, but I can say that it's a minority that is bigger in this country than in any other country. That is an American problem, because there is a certain temperature, around religion in this country that helps extremists to thrive. So there's a market in the media. So that is really a problem of this church. Now, I believe and I hope we have seen the worst in these last few years. I have been personally shocked by the fact that the US Bishop Conference said nothing against the attempts of some politicians and of the US president back then to limit the right to vote of many Americans, many of them, by the way, Catholics. So that was shocking. So there is a disease that has penetrated the Catholic Church, honestly, in the sense of a lack of political awareness that is about the rule of the game. When we start limiting the right to vote of people that don't vote like we would like, there should be some kind of intervention, and that never came. And so I believe we are on a possible path for recovering some sanity, but these last few years have been incredibly dangerous, also for the church at the risk of becoming subject to a political party, which is one of the worst things that can happen to Catholicism.
So is Joe Biden the man who can fix that? And if he is, how can he do that?
Well, he cannot fix that by himself, of course. Certainly, he's offering a model of leadership that is different, that is alternative, that is learning from his mistakes. I have said openly in other panels that I believe that the White House should open a channel of communication with the US bishops, I mean, discreetly, not in public, because I don't think US bishops are in a condition to do that. Now, it's in a chaos, the USCCB. I think the White House should do that because they can do that. And so that is possible. If I can use this metaphor, I believe that the Trump presidency might have vaccinated many of us from that disease. We saw how dangerous that is, and so that may help some people turn around and understand what is at stake here.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up this portion of the program and turn it over to Dr. Sebastian, because we are getting questions from the audience and I really want to get them. So take it away, John.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you so much for the really wonderful conversation. Very interesting, very timely, very important. We do have a couple of different questions that I would love to share with you from folks in our audience. And one of them asks us to think a little bit and reflect on how we make sense of a political figure like Joe Biden, who on the one hand will tell us in one moment that his Catholic faith forms his public policy positions on some issues, but then at other times and on other issues will tell us that he can't impose his religious beliefs on the general population. How do we make sense of what feels like that disconnect between those two different statements?
So this is a very important question. Now, of course, this question, I believe, refers to the issue of abortion.
I'm guessing so.
So here there has to be an honest acknowledgement that the position of the Catholic Church on abortion is very particular, and this is my position, honestly, but it's very particular and idiosyncratic if compared with the position of many churches, many religious traditions on immigration or on refugees or on climate change. And so here it is literally more difficult to find a moral common ground on some issues. And so that is the Catholic problem on issues, not just abortion, but on all bioethical issues, because Catholicism has carved itself a particular cultural niche that I believe it's very important, but it makes it a much harder job for any Catholic politician to be the spokesman for a moral consensus. Now, I believe that as a Catholic president, he could and should do more to push the conversation towards what was, for example, Bill Clinton's position: legal, safe, and rare. And no one now talks about rare anymore, or very, it's hard. So, but it's not that he's choosing some issues because it is politically convenient. It is factually much more complicated on some issues to speak as representative of your own church. That it is literally more difficult.
Well, I would only add one thing. You know, Joe Biden's a Democrat. If he came out against choice, abortion, I really doubt he would be elected. And that's just realistic. So it's maybe a difficult question for President Biden. I don't know what his personal beliefs are.
Well, he said a few times that he personally accepts the teaching of the church on abortion, but as a politician, he cannot impose the views of his church. So, which is interesting because it is different from the evangelical position, which is what is in the Bible is law, more or less, or from a more secular position, which says, I mean, religions should stay out simply. So he's interesting because he embodies the typical position of 20th century Catholic politicians who had to deal with this problem. And he's doing that carefully, I would say, in language. Now, it's much more complicated to convince Catholics of his argument, of course, but this is, I think, carefully crafted by him.
I will share with you that the person who posed that question initially has followed up to say thank you. And also, I could say that I am personally opposed to poverty based upon my Catholic faith, but I can't ask others to use their tax dollars to fight poverty, right? So just illustrating the trickiness, I think, of these kinds of propositions. I have another question here, which thinks about how all of this plays out really at the grassroots level and in our communities. And so one of our audience members says, you've said that the church in the US is divided and is likely to remain so, and you're not alone in that judgment. So do you have any advice for parish communities about how they live as divided communities? Should parishes be working to turn down the temperature on issues that divide us? Or should they provide a venue for those sides to kind of clash and sort out their differences? And if the latter, are there some kinds of ground rules that we ought to put into place for fostering those kinds of difficult conversations between the different parts of our communities?
That's complicated. I mean, that is happening already in some sense because there has been already a process of self-selection. And so some Catholics go to some parishes and some others to other parishes. And so some parishes are known for their socially progressive views and works, and others are more on the liturgical side and so on. So this has happened already. It's a very complicated job to be a pastor now or a parish priest because in the United States, the religious identity is essentially political. It's always been. And so it's easier. For example, I mean, being a Catholic in China is very complicated right now because it's a government that is, I mean, enemy of the freedom of religion and so on. But you don't have that problem of a division between Catholics in China. It's one church under persecution, but it's one church. It's exactly the opposite of our problem. And I don't have golden rules. I think that there are wise ways to address issues without being divisive, and a careful use of the media helps. And in my experience, the most divisive leaders in this church are the ones who are reckless in the media and social media. That's the number one thing to avoid, I would say.
Here's another question that we've gotten, and this takes us in another direction here. What do you see perhaps going forward as the role of kind of well-financed Catholic centers of power? So something like the Napa Institute, for instance, which is bringing together sort of well-heeled Catholics to really try to influence the direction of the church going forward. And there's been some recent reporting in the Catholic press about these sort of new centers of Catholic money, their alignment in some cases with what might be perceived as a kind of a Trumpist agenda. What do you see the role of those kinds of organizations going forward?
I believe that is a very present danger. So here, historically, I mean, churches that could rely on state funds, on taxpayers' money, so they are less subject to internal division because there is no private money driving agendas. So which is exactly our problem in this country now, and it's at every level, in parishes, in schools, in universities, think tanks. Money talks, and that can drive very politically partisan agendas within the church. Of course, they invest usually in the media, because of course that, I mean, amplify everything. Unfortunately, there's no law, there's no rule that in the church prohibits the use of money in that way. In some sense, it is the Citizen United effect in Catholicism.
And you talk about some of this in your book too, even in terms of those media outlets, right? That just as we've seen the ways in which the right has managed to really capitalize on the media, on talk shows, on whether radio or TV or these kinds of things, that so too the Catholic right has figured out how to leverage the media in different ways, which sometimes gives an impression that there isn't a corresponding progressive voice in the church. But as with politics, the progressive wing has just not done as good a job in embracing those tools in some ways, which then gives a somewhat slanted view of how big each camp is, right? I mean, that to me was a really important insight, I think, in your work.
Yeah. There's an asymmetry,
right?
Also because it's known that it's much easier to find Catholic conservative money for militant Catholic initiatives than progressive Catholic money. That it's in the it's there, and it is changing many dynamics, because of course, I mean, having money means that you can offer scholarships, so it creates a certain following, also of people that are in very good faith, but so they find opportunities where they are there. And so I believe the US bishops should pay more attention to this. But of course, in the United States, every level of the Catholic Church cannot function without money from big donors. And so it's very unpopular to alienate potential donors. And so that keeps many voices from speaking.
Here's another question we have. This person says, there have been a couple of articles out recently that have suggested that Biden has become a sort of moral leader or exemplar for more progressive Catholics who have been disappointed or distrustful of the bishops in the wake of the sexual abuse crisis. And she asks, what's your impression of this claim? Has Biden offered a more public progressive Catholicism to the US in contrast to the public face of the US hierarchy? Does he provide, in other words, a kind of a palatable alternative for some who are otherwise feeling angered or distrustful or aggrieved by the church?
In some sense, yes. So the authority of US bishops generally, except some exceptions, is in a deep crisis, more than in other countries, also because of the perceived partisanship. And so here, Joe Biden is a very interesting object to, of study, because he has stayed away carefully from the theological issues. He didn't talk about any doctrinal controversies. But I mean, people find leadership where there is. And so here Biden has no appetite, I think, to lead the Catholic Church instead of the bishops. But for many Catholics, he's a more credible leader than many of their bishops locally. And so these things happen, even if it's not in Joe Biden's intention. It's a model of alternative Catholic leadership. And I believe some bishops perceive that.
Great, thanks. Here's a question that's actually a follow-up, I think, to the previous topic, and it's a question for Carol, also for Massimo, if you care to weigh in. And it reads, we've already discussed the role of partisan groups and accompanying funding, and noted its influence in finding a platform in the news media. So what role, Carol, do you think journalism and the news media can play in informing the US public and in navigating the many voices in the social media sphere? What's the other side of this equation look like?
I think the media has yet to figure out how to cover things religious. I think either they make religious figures look crazy, or they latch on to a religious figure they really like. And, you could say that was Pope Francis, right? It's nary a criticism coming against Pope Francis. That's not Fox News, right? So I think that, I wish that more networks would hire religious reporters who kind of knew the space. And they've tried it a couple of times, but for some reason, they don't really put those people on the air very much. And until that happens, I don't think we will figure it out. There's also, people are less religious now too in the public, right? So that's another reason why, the mainstream media can't really figure it out, because it just assumes that younger viewers simply aren't interested, which I find sad, because, when you talk to many young people, they want some sort of spirituality in their life. They're yearning for that, and they can't find it because they don't know where to look. So it's a huge problem. And sadly, I don't see it being solved anytime soon.
I agree. I agree.
Fair enough. I think we have time for maybe one more question here. This one comes actually from the director of Muslim student life here at LMU, and he asks, what lessons in public service can other minority communities learn from the history of American Catholics in politics?
Well, so the history of Catholics in this country is a remarkable success against all odds. If you look at Al Smith, it was a downtrodden, humiliated community, and so here America offers all religions a space of freedom. And so that is the Catholic's history in this country, and it's becoming the history of other communities. And so it may become a post-American world. I don't think it will be replaced for the space that religions have by China or by India. I mean, America will remain a special place for all religions, I think.
Well, I was going to try and end on a positive note there, which I thought that question offered us there. But as we were wrapping, one more question has just slipped in under the wire. And I feel like if I don't ask it, I will feel like I have dodged the hard question later and I will regret it. So I will pose this to you, knowing full well that if there were an obvious answer, somebody would have come up with it already. But here's the question. Why hasn't the bad behavior of Donald Trump, from bragging about sexual assault to xenophobic and racial biased remarks, evoked more moral repugnance from the ranks of evangelicals and conservative Roman Catholics? And I think if you can answer that question, then we will have done our work here today. But so there you go. No pressure.
You want to start? No, I mean, it's very simple, in my opinion. The tragedy of this country is a two-party system, which has created a two-party church, which means a justification for anything my guy does. And it's a unique situation because in no big countries where religion has an important role, you have a two-party system. You have either many parties or one, like in China. So that has created in the American psyche a two-party metaphysics almost. This is something we should really look for a liberation for that, because it kills every possibility of critical thinking and so on. This is my vision of this. So Donald Trump was perceived as the savior against communism, against secularism. And if he's my savior, I will become blind to whatever he does. And that was not just evangelicals, but many Catholics, by the way. We know that, right? So I accept that there are two parties in this political system. As a green card holder, I cannot say anything about American politics. But philosophically, metaphysically, we should liberate our brain from the fact that everything is in two parties. That's my hope.
Thanks for that. And we've gotten some approval here for the idea of the concept of two-party metaphysics and how it traps us in these ways of thinking. I really want to sincerely thank you both for this really wonderful conversation and dialogue today about this hugely important topic. I think it's really critical that we have space for these kinds of conversations to delve into these issues for the health and well-being, both of our politics and of our faith and our church. And I'm glad that we can have this kind of space to come together for these kinds of thoughtful reflections on where we are today. Throughout your book, you continue to either hint or come right out and say that we really are at an inflection point in many ways, that the church is in danger of sort of pulling itself asunder. And as you say, the Catholic Church has always been imagined as a kind of a big tent where we can have different approaches to the same ideas, different spiritualities, different ways of enculturating our worship and our being with one another. But what we're facing now is really something quite different. Rival Catholicisms that can no longer tolerate one another. In the same way we see in our politics, rival systems that can no longer tolerate one another. This is neither the American way nor the Catholic way, or at least should not be the American way or the Catholic way. And so we're so grateful for the work that you have done in getting us to think critically about these topics and to really pause and imagine the church and the country that we want in the future. Because if we don't take these issues seriously now, we may find ourselves really heading down some paths that are going to be hard to come back from. So thank you for your prophetic voice in all of this. Carol, thank you for these really pressing questions and reflecting back so many of the experiences of people who are living through this moment. And thanks to all of our audience members who are with us today and provided these wonderful questions. It's been a privilege to be with all of you today. Thanks to everyone for being here, and be well. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carol.